When the mists dissipate and allow you to see the landscape bathed in a washed darkness of gray and shadow, the cold on your skin causes you to breathe in sharply, smelling what can only be described as burning flesh. It's not the cold that makes you shiver, however, as you hear the howl of many wolves and see pairs of red eyes in the darkness behind you, staring. You are now in Barovia. It wasn't until Curse of Strahd, coming out for 5th edition D&D, that I had played in such an atmospheric setting. The dark and gothic set pieces in a world casting eternal shadows shaped the way I looked at horror in RPGs altogether. This was the first RPG I had run, where the heroes weren't white knights, and those whose names are spoken in tall tales by bards and taverns. This was a setting of survival. It was a setting of horror. Welcome to Game On, a YouTube channel devoted to tabletop RPGs, board games, and overall tabletop gaming advice. I'm your host Justin, and with my co-host Matt, we have years of RPG, board gaming, and wargaming experience. Enjoy. Curse of Strahd was my second Adventurers League game I've run at my game store, yet I had played in countless homebrews and Adventurers League games as well. At the time, I was running it because it seemed interesting, but I hadn't yet given myself the goal to really spook my players. I mean, how could I? I was in a well-lit place with fast food and bad puns. It was a fun game, all my players loved it, but even though it was a horror setting, it wasn't a horror game. So, how does one make a spooky setting? How do you go from this to a setting like this? From my experience, there are two things that are needed to make a successful horror game. And by the way, I'm throwing the word horror around sort of loosely, but these are good suggestions to make your overall game more scary, spooky, terrorizing, or horrific. Both ideas are equally important. The first is in-game setting. You must set your in-game setting right if you want to increase the tension. There are multiple RPGs and horror settings. I'm most familiar with D&D and my favorite game, Call of Cthulhu. Whatever game system you use, make sure you are adamant about everything the senses take in. The intro to this video was an example. I wrote that to help you understand, without even picking up Curse of Strahd, that Barovia was a scary place. Make sure your players are always getting every detail you can give them, and keep doing it. Make sure they are fully aware and understand everything their character would. Mrs. Willows falls back behind the group of investigators on their way to the caves. The thick swamp mud is not a good mix with high heels. The swamp gives off a pungent odor that is a mix of rotting vegetation and moldy meat. She hears squishing behind her, and she turns to look. The light of the lantern, though good at piercing the dark, is not great at piercing the swamp gas that fills your lungs as you breathe. Continuing on, Mrs. Willows hears the wet noise again, but keeps facing forward. "I guess I'm just hearing things," she says. Now this isn't really going to jump scare anyone. Even with a great description and really setting the tone of the game, players probably knew her fate already. Now you can subvert expectations and reveal that maybe she was the frogman your group was hunting all along, which is actually a pretty cool idea. But hitting with the second pillar to horror play, the setting, is what's really going to give them the 1-2 punch. "But you already said the setting, Justin," you say. Yes, we set the game world setting. This is the easy part. Many online guides will teach you about game setting tips, but not too many about the setting you play the actual game in. This is Mansions of Madness, not D&D, but notice how different the background is? This is someone's home, a controlled environment, the best place to run a horror game. I want you to decide here, which one of these two examples has a little bit more atmosphere? Okay guys, it seems that once you step outside your house, there is a slightly darker shade of night that is cast upon you. The moon isn't nearly as bright as it was before going in, even though it wasn't bright to begin with. It started to rain, and you can hear the crackle of thunder. As you can see, the village peoples about 2 kilometers down the long road, coming up with carts filled with something that you can't quite make out. You can hear the wolves crying in the night, and you can hear what sounds like something coming from the woods to the west. Or this. As you guys leave the house that you entered not longer than 30 minutes ago, you realize that the already dark moon seems to have become dimmer, and the night seems to be darker. In the distance you can hear thunder, and it's complemented by the big fat, wet, cold raindrops that touch you when they fall down. In the distance you can see what seems like townsfolk coming up with carts, but you can't see what's in them about 2 kilometers away. You can hear the howl of wolves in the distance. You can't quite figure out which direction they're coming from, but you can hear something coming from the woods to the west. The setup for the second shot only took about 4 minutes. Minus the atmospheric music I usually play, a simple Spotify or YouTube search can give great thunderstorm ambiance. Turning the lights down and putting other lighting with a simple piece of paper taped to the shade to diffuse the lights puts shadows at odd angles. The iris of the camera couldn't quite pick it up, but there was more than enough light to see. The players could write, they could see their dice numbers, but the lighting really helps with the mood. A candle in a jar, far enough away from all flammables, is also a great idea. And as you, the GM, try to make it so that the lighting on your face isn't perfect. Players try to anchor themselves on GM facial expressions. It's not a spooky game if the GM laughed at the player trying to make a tension-breaking joke. Your players can easily roleplay that their characters are scared. That's all well and good, but a GM's true desire is to get the players scared as well. The best way to physically connect a player to the game world is props. I spoil my players. I give them piles of props to sift through because making the players put things into perspective is a lot more engaging than an investigation roll or a library use roll. I use props in both D&D and Call of Cthulhu, and both serve similar purposes. The ability to physically hold something in your hand to inspect as a player has a dramatic impact on how the players actually feel in the game. Combine this with the grim atmosphere both in-game and in the gaming location, and you'll get your players good. I have a quick story from Call of Cthulhu. My players were in a dark house playing with odd lighting where the PCs were being hunted down by a monster in-game. They had tons of physical props at their disposal to figure out it was something really bad. We were in the heat of the moment when someone knocked on the door to the house. Suffice to say, we all jumped, to the point where we had to take a 5-minute break because our hearts were racing so much. You can get your players into a great mood, feeling almost as scared as their characters. I'm going to give some overall tips on running a horror game that applies to a multitude of game systems. However, this part in particular is for 5th edition D&D. Dresden Files, Dread, Cthulhu, Traveler, and all other gaming systems won't benefit from these tips in particular, but I'll go over those general tips just after this. Okay, 5th edition GMs, I have to be frank with you. Now, I really enjoy 5th edition, but one of its faults is that it sucks to run a horror game. It's hard to be afraid of skeletons and werebears when a cleric can just hold up a holy symbol, or any multitude of healing classes throws a healing word at the fighter to keep her going. So what do? I've run a couple of horror settings in D&D, but I'll use Curse of Strahd as my primary example, as I'm fresh off a second running of it. When I first ran Curse of Strahd, I was bound to Adventurers League rules. It made it easier to be survivable. The second go-around was a lot better. As GMs, we have a few solutions. Mind you, I'm going to discuss this later in the video. Make sure your players know beforehand and are on board with your tweaks. Aside from just keeping your table's PC's levels low, like levels 1 through 4, I suggest any combination of the following. The first is healing. In Barovia, Strahd reigns supreme. Why would you let your players heal easily? Maybe that 8 hit points of healing your cleric just gave you does 4, as all PCs are resistant to healing in his domain. Your barbarian got hit by a werewolf and contracted lycanthropy? Uh-oh, your cured disease doesn't work on lycanthropy. You have to seek out Wolfsbane on top of the mountain to the west, guarded by hags, to cure him. Make him roll a constitution save every day. If they fail, reduce their con score by 1d4 until they take a long rest. Speaking of rest, the brutal rules in the DMG gives the option that a week is a long rest, and an 8-hour night is a short rest. Your clerics turn undead isn't as effective, or monsters that seem not as scary either hit harder or their numbers are drastically increased. Make the players figure out that running is sometimes a more viable option than fighting. The Madness table on the DMG is also a great feature to add. Make your PCs go insane and have odd quirks about them, like they run from all danger or are prone to mistrusting everyone. Here are my tips for GMs and players who want to run a successful horror game. Rule number 1. Make sure your players are all on board with the horror game. Part of the social contract is everyone is on board with the game. Give players time to back out if that's not what they're looking for. I once ran a game where I wanted it to be a horror game, but the players did not. Situations like that can send a game spiraling out of control. Rule 2. Set boundaries. Part of the fun of horror is pushing your limits to see if you can be creeped out. However, some people have hard limits. I, for one, don't want anything to do with rape or sexual assault in my game. If the PCs come up to a dead, disfigured child in a haunted mansion, it can break the immersion if your players are too uncomfortable to be in that situation. Rule 3. Play the game. Everyone has to be active in the game to make it work. That means you two players. It also means putting cell phones away, ordering and eating your pizza beforehand, and getting all housekeeping out of the way. Play the game. Rule 4, and most important of all, it's a game, guys. Have fun with it. You're playing to be creeped out. Make sure everyone is okay with that, and the game may be harder. We play games to have fun. Remember that. With these tips, go out and make your games a little more spooky. Note that the D&D tips don't have to be applied only to Curse of Strahd, but any D&D game. For those of you who want to try playing a different system designed for creepy terror, check out 7th edition Call of Cthulhu on Chaosium's website. They have a quick start rules to getting into the game easy and free. Traveler players, there's a Cthulhu compendium called Chthonian Stars on DriveThruRPG. I'd go check that out. I hope all you viewers can take these tips and go out and have fun. Game on.